Hello there! I am here to discuss some of the things that happened in the US ever since the British sent the first colonists. Let me start with something that changes the way we do things pretty often just to explain a little if another one pops up soon. I'm talking about something called landmark Supreme Court cases. These are Supreme Court cases that shape the world we know around us today to be a more free and equal place. Our civil rights and liberties have been shaped by these decisions of the Supreme Court. These decisions are split into two categories: civil rights and civil liberties cases. Let us begin. Before I talk about what exactly each case is, I would like to explain what exactly the Supreme Court is and what they do. The Supreme Court is the highest court in the U.S. and has been given certain abilities to ensure justice. Article 3 of the U.S. Constitution gives the Supreme Court jurisdiction over specific cases that involve a federal-level issue. The court also claimed the power of judicial review after the events of Marbury v. Madison, which is the power to decide whether or not certain laws and government action are constitutional. Let us start with some of the civil rights cases. These include Marbury v. Madison 1803, Plessy v. Ferguson 1896, Brown v. the Board of Education 1954, and in Ray Galton 1967. So what's the deal with Marbury v. Madison? Well, it gets a bit complicated. It all started with President John Adams, who appointed several federal judges and justices of the peace but failed to get all of the paperwork and appointments completed before leaving office. Hopefully, the new president Thomas Jefferson could send them all that he thought, but the man refused. This angered all of the soon-to-be judges, but a man named William Marbury had had enough and sued James Madison, who was Jefferson's Secretary of State, since it was his responsibility to send out the paperwork, which Jefferson refused to let him do. See where the name is starting to make sense? The Supreme Court ruled that the law which allowed Marbury to sue was unconstitutional, which goes down as the first time. The Supreme Court ruled that part of a law was unconstitutional, with the court claiming that
it is the duty of the judicial department to say what the law is. Those who apply the rule to particular cases must, of necessity, interpret the rule. If two laws conflict with each other, the court must decide on the operation of each.
Next up is Plessy v. Ferguson. This happened because, in Louisiana, the law said African Americans and whites had to ride in equal but separate train cars. One day, a man named Homer Plessy decided to take a train ride while in Louisiana. The issue was that Plessy was 1/8 African American, but insisted on sitting in the car that was meant for only white people. He argued the fairness of the different races in different cars because they were not always equal, and it violated the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause, which says the law must apply to everyone equally and cannot discriminate against citizens or groups of citizens. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court did not favor Plessy, stating,
"We consider the underlying fallacy of Thepletiff's argument to consist in the assumption that the enforced separation of the two races stamps the colored race with a badge of inferiority. If this be so, it is not because of anything found in the act, but solely because the colored race chooses to put that construction upon it. If the civil and political rights of both races be equal, one cannot be inferior to the other civilly or politically. If one race is inferior to the other socially, the Constitution of the United States cannot put them on the same plane."
Which says that segregation based on race was legal as long as everything else was equal. After this is Brown v. Board of Education, which is considered one of the most important civil rights cases in American history. After the outcome of Plessy v. Ferguson, separate but equal started to spread everywhere, including schools. Some loved the idea of separate but equal and started to separate, but not make things equal. One example of someone speaking out about this is when the Brown family sued the Topeka, Kansas School Board for discrimination. They were arguing the same thing as Plessy, which is that racial separation violates the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause. The strange thing is they won the case with the court saying,
We conclude in the field of public education the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. Separate educational facilities are inherently unequal.
this removal of separate but equal spread around, just like the clause did when first introduced, and soon, many places were treating even more people equally. This last case had a big impact on society and especially youth. And it is called In re Gault. Gault was a 15-year-old at the time of the incident who was arrested for making a not-e phone call and denied due process or his right to fair treatment by the law only because he was a juvenile. Gault was tried in juvenile court and sentenced to 6 years in reform school, but later appealed to the state's Supreme Court, which also ruled that he did not have the right to due process because he was a juvenile. This led to Gault appealing to the Supreme Court, who finally agreed that his rights were violated and gave him justice. The Supreme Court stated that juveniles have many of the same rights as adults and that
Neither the 14th Amendment nor the Bill of Rights is for adults alone.
Now that we have covered civil rights cases, what about all of the civil liberties cases? Well, let's start with this first one called Gideon v. Wainwright. Clarence Gideon was convicted of a crime and had to defend himself throughout since he was denied an attorney, which he felt violated his 6th Amendment rights to legal counsel and 14th Amendment rights to equal protection. The Supreme Court ruled in his favor and stated that
Lawyers in criminal courts are necessities, not luxuries.
this outcome had a major impact on society, and it was pretty clear to the Supreme Court that having a lawyer was vital since the rights of the accused are a significant part of the Bill of Rights because we want to ensure everyone has the same liberties under the rule of law. Next up is a memorable and probably familiar one, which is Miranda v. Arizona. What makes this one so memorable is the fact that it has been heard many times, since it can be heard in police shows and from the actual police. What we hear them say is called Miranda rights, which is a list of rights spoken to the accused which gets its name from this case. Miranda was arrested, tried, and locked up for kidnapping. The strange thing is he wasn't told about his right to remain silent or to be given legal counsel. He appealed to the Supreme Court for the government violating his 5th Amendment, the right to protect against self-incrimination. And the court agreed with him, saying,
The prosecution may not use statements from questioning initiated by law enforcement officers after a person has been taken into custody or otherwise deprived of his freedom of action in any significant way, unless it demonstrates the use of procedural safeguards effective to secureth Fifth Amendment's privilege against self-incrimination.
After this decision, from now on, officers were forced to say the Miranda rights, beginning with you have the right to remain silent, and suspects cannot be forced to give up their 5th Amendment protections. Most of these instances have been discussing a wider range of people, but now let's talk about some of students' rights. This next one is Tinker v. Des Moines, which has to do with the First Amendment of free speech and how it is applied in schools. This all started when two students from Des Moines, Iowa named John Tinker and Mary Beth Tinker, who were siblings who both wore black armbands, to protest the Vietnam War and refused to remove them. They were suspended for the fact and decided to take the case to court since they believed this violates their First Amendment free speech. The Supreme Court agreed and stated,
In wearing armbands, the petitioners were quiet and passive. They were not disruptive and did not impinge upon the rights of others. In these circumstances, their conduct was within the protection of the free speech clause of the First Amendment and the due process clause of the 14th.
This just says that students keep their constitutional rights. even while at school, which contrasts the public belief that you had no rights while in school. Another one of these school-related cases happened with Hazelwood School District v. Kuhlmeyer, which was when a group of students took their school district to court over what they could publish in their newspaper after the principal removed two articles for being inappropriate. They also believed that their First Amendment rights were violated, but specifically the right to freedom of the press. The court disagreed with the students and stated,
First Amendment rights of students in the public schools are not automatically coextensive with the rights of adults in other settings and must be applied in light of the special characteristics of the school environment. A school need not tolerate student speech that is inconsistent with its basic educational mission, even though the government could not censor similar speech outside the school.
This says that schools can limit freedom of speech if it disrupted the learning environment. This differs from the previous case because the previous case involved peaceful and non-disruptive protesting in the form of armbands. Moving on from schools, now we have the case of U.S. v. Nixon, which deals with the most important part of our Constitution. This is that everyone is treated equally under the law, which sadly had to take an entire case just to make clear. This all started when 5 men who were working for Nixon's re-election campaign broke into the HQ of the Democratic National Committee in D.C. When they discovered that they were associated with Nixon, Nixon was asked to send in any tapes that could provide evidence and information. Nixon didn't budge and claimed that the tapes were protected by executive privilege and that the conversations were private and didn't need to be shared. The U.S. took him to court arguing the constitutionality of his decisions under the rule of law. Nixon lost, and the Supreme Court said,
Neither the doctrine of separation of powers nor the generalized need for confidentiality of high-level communications without more can sustain an absolute, unqualified presidential privilege of immunity from judicial process under all circumstances.
This truly outlined the rule of law and serves as a warning for anyone who tries to play with this again. Next up is another fiasco that deals with presidents, but specifically possible future presidents. This is known today as Bush v. Gore and started with a close call. The election between George W. Bush and Al Gore came down to the popular vote in Florida, which would claim all of their electoral votes and ultimately decide the president. Although there were some issues with some ballots in some counties in Florida, so the FL Supreme Court pulled a hand recount for votes in those counties. Bush, who was in the lead, asked the U.S. Supreme Court to stop the recount, arguing that it violated the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause because it says states must apply the law equally to everyone. This meant that recounting some votes wouldn't be fair, and that they would have to recount all of them, which he argued was discriminatory. The U.S. Supreme Court agreed, which ended the recount, and they said,
The Equal Protection Clause's requirements apply to the manner in which voting franchise is exercised, having once granted the right to vote on equal terms, Florida may not, by later arbitrary and disparate treatment, value one person's vote over that of another.
This set a precedent for future cases and certified Bush as the President of the United States. Finally, we have District of Columbia v. Heller, which has greatly impacted our civil liberties and is the most recent case to date. This all started when Washington, D.C. decided to pass an ordinance that limited the rights of all gun owners, which was frowned upon by a group of private gun owners, which included Mr. Heller. They filed a suit in federal court, claiming the ordinance violated their Second Amendment right to bear arms. The federal court argued that the right applied to mainly militias and the National Guard. Heller won, with the Supreme Court saying,
The Second Amendment protects an individual right to possess a firearm unconnected with service in a militia and to use that firearm for traditionally lawful purposes, such as self-defense within the home.
Earlier, I mentioned a couple of amendments that correlated to the different cases listed, but let's explore more of these amendments. And what exactly did each amendment help us out with? Let's start with the Voting Rights Amendments, which were primarily caused by the 13th, 14th, 19th, 24th, and 26th Amendments. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery and was the first amendment that black people receiving voting since a new minority was allowed to do some things that they couldn't before. They ended up not giving slaves the right to vote, but was the first step to making that a reality. This was ratified in 1865. Even with this good change, there were still problems. The 14th Amendment established a naturalization system and gives anyone born or naturalized citizen status. This established the rules and meant that men over 21 can vote as directly implied, and no longer had to own land or be white. This was ratified in 1868. The 19th Amendment granted suffrage to women 21 and older like men. Women were not allowed to vote for the longest time, which is surprising since they take up half the population. This was ratified in 1920. The 24th Amendment abolished poll taxes, which were created to prevent the poor from voting. People saw this as a constitution infringing rule and were quick to abolish it. This was ratified in 1964. The 26th Amendment is the most recent of these amendments, which lowered the voting age from 21 to 18, which was fueled by the soldiers' mandat. They had to be in the army but still couldn't vote. The idea was, if you are the age to completely function like a regular adult and share some of the same things, then you should share their voting rights too. This was ratified in 1971. While many were overjoyed with some people's new abilities in voting for the 13th, 14th, and 15th, some were mad at the choices and some chose to make some barriers to keep certain people out of the voting pool. One of these barriers was called the literacy test, which was often used as a way to keep African Americans and the poor from voting. Some of these were somewhat impossible, since some were asking for 100% accuracy in a short amount of time. Individuals and small groups of people were protesting and going into legal battles against the governments who were making these rules. There were also marches and civil disobedience, all in protest of the literacy test. People started to realize how cruel the literacy test was, and it slowly got better with help coming in the form of laws passed by the government, protecting the civil rights of the minority groups being attacked. Thankfully, they created the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibited employers from discrimination based on race or sex, and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which made racial discrimination illegal in voting laws and banned literacy tests. Then the Civil Rights Act of 1968 banned discrimination based on race or sex in house buying and selling. Let's also not forget to mention the Equal Rights Amendment, which would keep state and federal laws from discriminating based on sex, although it hasn't been ratified yet for many reasons. This means that it is not officially a part of our Constitution. Remember when I mentioned the 14th Amendment? Let me give you a better understanding of what exactly it includes. So the 14th Amendment defines citizens as all persons born or naturalized in the United States. The strangest thing is that it took the government 82 years after the Constitution was written to add anything about naturalization and citizenship. According to the 14th Amendment, anyone who was born in the United States or an immigrant, a person who comes to another country to live there, and has gone through the naturalization process can become a citizen if not already. If you were born a citizen, that probably means that you were either born through the law of blood, which means your parents are citizens, or the law of soil, which means you were born on the land of the country. To apply for citizenship, you have to be at least 18, have been a resident for at least 5 years without leaving, file a petition for naturalization, take a test that shows that you can read, write, and speak in English, prove you understand us history and the Constitution, prove good moral character, proof of good moral character from U.S. citizens, and finally take the oath of allegiance. The naturalization process impacts our society in many ways. Since each year an estimate of around 680,000 people become naturalized in the U.S., many people debate immigration with some talking about who should be granted citizenship, how difficult should it be to become a citizen, how long should immigrants be allowed to live in the U.S. without becoming or applying to become a citizen, and whether should we limit immigration in general. For certain reasons, naturalization is something that politicians and political candidates use to influence how voters feel about the naturalization process. Immigrants themselves have a strong influence, since their numbers keep growing and they have experience with issues in other countries, which could help influence them to make a better and safer decision. They also have many of the same rights and liberties as other born citizens. Naturalized citizens are allowed to vote like any born citizen. And ever since the Voting Rights Act of 1965, it is way easier to vote since the act requires ballots to be printed in all of the languages in a country where at least 5% of the population speak that language. The 14th Amendment sure does do some amazing things for us, and anyone who wants to become one of us. It defines and shows what the we and we the people is and can be for anyone seeking it. America sure is interesting.
Hey, did you know that the Declaration of Independence was a result of English policies and responses to colonial concerns?
Really? What kind of policies?
Well, in the years leading up to the American Revolution, England implemented a number of policies that deeply concerned the American colonists. Many of these policies were designed to increase England's control over the colonies and extract more resources and revenue from them. One of the most significant policies was the Stamp Act of 1765, which required colonists to purchase special stamps for all legal documents, newspapers, and other printed materials. Another key policy was the Townshend Acts of 1767, which imposed taxes on a variety of imported goods. In addition to these policies, the colonists were also frustrated by England's responses to their concerns and protests. These policies and responses ultimately led to the writing of the Declaration of Independence in 1776, which declared the colonists' independence from England, and stated that all people are created equal and have certain fundamental rights.
The next day.
Hey, did you know that the U.S. government creates policies to address domestic and international issues to protect the welfare of the American people and advance national interests?
Really? What kind of policies?
Domestic policies include economic, health, education, and social policies. For instance, the government implements policies to promote economic growth, reduce unemployment, and stabilize prices. They're also responsible for providing access to healthcare for all citizens, overseeing education at all levels, and developing strategies to address problems related to poverty, homelessness, and other social challenges. On the other hand, foreign policy includes national security, diplomacy, and international agreements. The government interacts with other countries on economic issues, such as trade, investment, and development assistance.
The next day.
Hey, have you ever wondered about the political parties in America and their ideas about government?
Yeah, I'm not really sure what they stand for. Can you tell me more?
Sure thing, currently. There are two major political parties in America, the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. The Democratic Party generally believes in a more active and involved government that promotes social welfare, civil rights, and equality. They advocate for government programs to help marginalized groups, such as universal health care and increased public education funding. They also support environmental regulations and policies to combat climate change. On the other hand, the Republican Party generally believes in a smaller, less involved government that focuses on individual liberties and free market principles. They advocate for lower taxes and less government regulation of businesses, support a strong military, and have a strict approach to law and order. Despite their differences, both parties aim to improve the country and protect the interests of the American people.
John Z was voluntarily cleaning the streets when he saw a man put a poster on the wall, not just one, but many, where it came to the point where it was a lot. He went over to check out what was going on. He read the poster, and it said, "Vote for Frozen Fish Stick as the new governor." Frozen Fish Stick was part of the Republican Party, and John Z was part of the Democratic Party. Jonesy knew that Frozen Fish Stick was the vice governor for World Cup Fish Stick, the governor last year who, by the way, was a great governor. John Z thought he would be in good hands if Frozen Fish Stick won, until he opened Twitter and saw that Frozen would lower taxes but raise governmental spending. This disappointed him, so he asked his Democratic political friends who were planning on running against Frozen Fish Stick, and none of the responses were good. John Z felt defeated and very disappointed, but then he had the idea to run for mega city governor. Let me tell you how he will win the election. There is something that cannot be forgotten about, and that this is the media, the most important thing to a political campaign, and here's how he will use it. He posts stuff on websites like Twitter and Facebook about what he will achieve and what he already has. He also made a website that probably has a bias toward him. The main kind of propaganda that he uses is the plain folks style. He uses this because it has the politicians connect to the common folk, showing them being very similar and how they are just like the viewer. He does this by showing that he volunteered for community services and how he helps the communities. The others that either he or his opponent uses are endorsements, testimonials. This is when a celebrity or any important person gets involved with a product, item, or groupthink political parties and says positive stuff about it. An example of this is when Jonesy got Ninja to support his campaign, jumping on the bandwagon. This is when a person uses the number of people that used to peer pressure them into agreeing. An example is when FFS said the number of people that voted for him and WCFS last time. Name calling. This is when someone makes fun of a politician or political group negatively, usually through the media. For example, FFS made a political cartoon with a nasty proportion, Jonesy, with the word stupid over it. Glitter generalities. This is when the item, idea, or message is portrayed in a positive, simple way that gives no information. An example is when Jonesy made a poster with his face on it, with the words victory under it in red, white, and blue. Card stacking. This is when one item compares another, only showing the good for them and the bad for the other. An example is when FFS made a card on what made him better than Jonesy. Transfer. This is the technique of manipulating your feelings into feeling positivity toward a specific thing. An example would be how FFS and Jonesy made their websites and other propaganda red, white, and blue to symbolize patriotism. Oh, and I almost forgot, he made a campaign speech. And one very important thing he talked about was the responsibilities of citizens.
I thought that maybe we could put more money into community service and other responsibilities. This may include community service, voting, attending public meetings, and petitioning the government. If you didn't know, these are responsibilities that citizens aren't required to do but help the common good. Community service by choice could be picking up garbage, planting trees, or anything that helps the community. Voting. Alright, I think we all know how to vote. But if you don't, then it's just like a poll, and used for deciding who wins stuff like elections, and again it is voluntary. So you don't have to go out of your way to vote if that's not something you want to do. Attending public meetings is the best way to keep in touch with current politics and news in the area, close. And the final responsibility I wanted to talk about is petitioning the government. If you disagree with what is happening in government or want to change, you can just make a petition and have people sign it. We'll look at it and make the change.
He says more stuff, but that's not important. There will be a debate soon. But at the time of writing this, it hasn't happened yet, trust me. I'll be waiting, but in the meantime, this is how John Z will win the governor's election in Mega City. That is if he wins.